Few health beliefs are as widespread as the idea that cold weather gives you a cold. It feels obvious. Spend an afternoon outside without a jacket. Wake up 2 days later with a sore throat, and the conclusion seems impossible to avoid. The cold made you sick. That belief is so intuitive because it appears to match everyday experience. Colds become far more common as temperatures fall. Parents warn children to bundle up before going outside. People remember the winter walk that was followed by days of coughing and congestion. The pattern repeats often enough that it feels less like a coincidence and more like a law of nature. But there's a problem with that explanation. If cold itself caused colds, simply lowering a person's body temperature should reliably make them ill. Yet millions of people spend their lives in extremely cold environments without constantly developing respiratory infections. At the same time, people catch colds during warm summers, in tropical climates, and even after spending most of their time indoors. Temperature alone cannot explain what we observe. The misconception comes from treating two events that often happen together as though one directly causes the other. Winter and colds arrive at roughly the same time, so our brains naturally connect them. But sharing the same season is not the same as sharing the same cause. That raises a more fundamental question. If being cold cannot create a cold on its own, what actually does? A common cold always begins the same way, not with cold air, but with a virus. Most often that virus is a rhinovirus, although several other respiratory viruses can produce nearly identical symptoms. These viruses spread from one person to another through tiny respiratory droplets and aerosols released when someone breathes, talks, coughs, or sneezes. They can also reach a new host indirectly after contaminated hands touch the eyes, nose, or mouth. However they arrive, one requirement never changes. The virus has to enter the body. That simple fact immediately changes the story. You can spend hours in freezing temperatures and never develop a cold if no virus reaches you. Conversely, you can become infected on a warm summer day after a brief conversation with someone carrying the virus. Temperature may change the circumstances, but it cannot replace the virus itself. Once inside the nose or throat, the virus begins attaching to cells lining the respiratory tract. It enters those cells and uses their machinery to produce thousands of copies of itself. As the infection spreads, the immune system detects the invasion and launches its response. Ironically, many of the symptoms we associate with a cold are not caused directly by the virus. The sore throat, congestion, runny nose, and sneezing are largely consequences of the body's attempt to eliminate the infection. Increased mucus traps viral particles, inflammation recruits immune cells, and sneezing helps expel irritants from the airways. Feeling sick is often evidence that your immune system is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. By itself, this explains why a virus is necessary, but it leaves another puzzle unresolved. If viruses cause colds year-round, why do infections become so much more common when the weather turns cold? If viruses are always the true cause, why do colds surge every winter? The answer is that cold doesn't create the virus. It changes the conditions that make infection more likely. One change is behavioral. As temperatures drop, people spend more time indoors with windows closed, sharing the same air for longer periods. A virus released by one person is simply more likely to reach someone else when people gather in enclosed spaces than when they're spread out outdoors. The environment changes as well. Many of the viruses responsible for the common cold remain stable longer in cool, dry conditions. Winter air also holds less moisture, and when that air is heated indoors, it becomes drier still. Dry air allows tiny respiratory particles to linger differently and dries the lining of the nose, reducing one of the body's first physical barriers against invading pathogens. Cold air may also have a more direct effect on the nose itself. Research suggests that cooling the tissues inside the nasal passages can temporarily reduce some of their local antiviral defenses. Cells that normally help detect and slow down invading viruses may become slightly less effective when those tissues are colder. The virus still has to be present, but it may face less resistance during the earliest stages of infection. None of these factors is sufficient on its own. Cold weather does not manufacture viruses, and a weakened defense cannot produce an infection without one. Instead, winter aligns several small advantages in the virus's favor. People have more opportunities to transmit it, the environment may preserve it longer, and the body's first line of defense may become a little less effective. What looks like a single cause is actually the combined effect of several interacting mechanisms. And because those mechanisms appear together every winter, it's easy to mistake the cold itself for the culprit. The belief survives because it fits the way our brains naturally explain events. Imagine someone spends an afternoon outside in the cold. 2 days later, they develop a runny nose and sore throat. The cold exposure is memorable, so it becomes the obvious explanation. But those 2 days are also almost exactly how long many cold viruses take to produce symptoms after infection. In other words, the infection often began before the person ever realized they were sick. Winter reinforces this illusion. Respiratory viruses circulate more efficiently during the colder months, increasing the chances of encountering an infected person. At the same time, cold weather becomes the most noticeable change in daily life. When illness follows, the visible event, the chilly walk home, or the forgotten jacket, is easier to remember than the invisible one. Inhaling a microscopic virus hours or even days earlier. Our minds are especially good at connecting events that occur close together in time. This tendency usually helps us understand cause and effect, but it can also create convincing misconceptions when the true cause is hidden. Because viruses are invisible and infection begins long before symptoms appear, the real chain of events is easy to overlook. The result is a story that feels perfectly logical. Cold comes first. Illness comes later. The conclusion seems obvious. It just isn't the complete explanation. So, can cold give you a cold? Not by itself. The common cold begins only when a virus successfully infects your respiratory tract. Without that virus, you can spend hours in freezing temperatures and never become ill. Cold is not the cause of the disease. It changes the odds that the disease will occur. Seen this way, the entire chain becomes clear. Winter encourages people to spend more time in enclosed spaces, where viruses spread more easily. Cooler, drier conditions can help some viruses remain infectious for longer, and may slightly reduce the effectiveness of the nose's first line of defense. Those factors increase the chance that a virus will establish an infection, but they never replace the virus itself. This distinction matters because it changes where prevention should focus. Staying warm may make you more comfortable, but avoiding infection depends far more on limiting exposure to respiratory viruses, improving ventilation, washing hands when appropriate, and staying away from others when sick. These measures interrupt the actual cause rather than one of the conditions that can support it. The old belief contains a small piece of truth, wrapped around a mistaken conclusion. Cold weather is linked to colds, but not because low temperature creates illness. It shapes an environment in which viruses gain an advantage. Once you separate the virus from the weather, the contradiction disappears. Cold doesn't give you a cold. It helps explain why the virus that does is often waiting for its opportunity.